Grandpa's eccentric neighbor put a dead bird on our doorstep after I filed a noise complaint against her unsettling Halloween soundscape. My 22 male grandpa's neighbor is probably in her late 30s. I am staying with him for a while because of a roommate situation. His property is a few acres and the neighbor's lot is similar. They are separated by trees. My grandpa has a dog, an old German Shepherd. He's gotten sensitive to noises lately. Here's the problem. Neighbor is a Halloween fanatic. My grandpa said she gets her Halloween decor up in late August, but the issue isn't the decor. It's that she's got this odd soundscape. The soundscape includes a fireworks/gunshot type cluster of bangs that happen every so often. Given the distance between the homes, we shouldn't be able to hear any of it. Anyway, she runs it from about 5 p.m. till 10 p.m. They don't get trick or treaters or anything in this area. Houses are too far apart/have long private drives, so all of this is for herself. My grandpa is too nice/conflict avoidant to do anything about it. But I feel so bad for the dog. After a day of the sounds triggering the dog, I went over and I introduced myself. It was my first time meeting her, so I didn't want to immediately launch into my complaint. I went along with some conversation to build rapport. She was extremely chatty at first, asked a lot of questions about me, tried to guess my ethnicity. I have a racially ambiguous face and she wanted to prove she could read my features or whatever. From there she started telling me which celebrities I remind her of, haven't heard of any of them, and then she started talking about horror movies. I couldn't get a word in. I had to interrupt her. I explained about our dog. Started with, maybe you could consider using a different soundscape, or turning it down? As soon as I brought this topic up she got all cold. Her whole demeanor towards me changed, but she did agree she would turn it down. She didn't. So I turned up to her door for the second time, yesterday. This is when it got weird. She answered the door in a full costume and was putting on a character that she didn't feel necessary to drop while talking to me. I tried to let her know I'm going to be making a noise complaint if she doesn't adjust her soundscape. I asked her how come she didn't turn it down? She ignored this by telling me I'll look like I have a delicious liver. It's hard to express how frustrating it was. I said nothing. I just stared at her, irritated, hoping she'd drop the act. Instead of getting serious she kept the weird voice going and told me, lower your eyebrow, why are you so grumpy? She also tried to reach out slowly to touch my face or something. I just turned around and left. This woman was still in her fucking character. She said something after me but I was not able to make it out enough to quote it here. I got home and made a noise complaint. Cops took my statement, then they went over and talked with her. No more soundscape. Peace and quiet. Today she left a dead bird on the doorstep. Update 1. A few people reached out to see if anything happened on Halloween. I was going to wait on an update until there was a conclusion, but I'm not sure when that might be. To avoid spamming, I won't be making any other updates until this matter is resolved. To answer the question I got the most, I wasn't at my grandpa's place on Halloween or the following day, but he told me he saw the neighbor in the woods by his property line. She was wearing a costume, looking something like the girl from The Ring. He said he noticed her standing there facing the house in the middle of the day on Halloween, but other than that nothing happened. I was here on Saturday and that's when she threw a party. It was raining but you could hear the bass from her music and there were cars in her driveway. Around 10 p.m., the doorbell rang and when I answered, it was her, looking just like my grandpa had described. Same costume. I couldn't see her face that well through all the hair, but I recognized her voice. She seemed panicked and she was speaking so fast I couldn't make out everything she was saying, but the gist of it was that she needed help, and wanted me to call an ambulance. Before I could process what was happening, or even say anything, she hugged me. It wasn't really a normal hug. But I don't know how else to describe it. Currently, I have an arm sling for an injury, so when she slammed into me, that arm got sandwiched between us and the sudden pain made me tense up and freeze. I genuinely thought she was in distress and believed her because it seemed different than the time she was acting like some character. I think I said something like it's okay. I'll help you in an attempt to reassure her, and with my free hand I tried to push her head away. She was clinging to me so hard, I didn't know what to do. She was making these weird hiccuping sounds and was covered in something that smelled like diesel. The party was still going so I just assumed it had something to do with that. Maybe she was intoxicated or under the influence of something. I told her I needed to get my phone so I could make the call. I asked her some questions but she didn't answer. She eventually calmed down and let me go. She stood by the door, all quiet. I wanted to get my phone first anyway, but by the time I returned, she was gone. I checked the camera and it showed she walked off the porch. The police took 50 minutes to arrive that night. I explained what happened and showed them the porch camera footage. They went to her house for a wellness check, and an ambulance showed up too. They told me to stay at my house so I didn't go with them. Today she came by looking normal. She asked why I called the cops on her party and completely denied it was her at my door the other night. I didn't bother with the conversation after that, I just shut the door in her face. Update 2. My grandpa's dog died, from old age, at the end of last year. I was with him when it happened. It was something we were anticipating, so I don't suspect the neighbor at all. My grandpa was devastated though, because they were both old guys together. But he also never went anywhere because of his dog. After the dog died, I convinced my grandpa to go visit my parents with me. There has been no contact from her since the order. Some things that happen between updates. 1. There is a homeless guy who has a dog. He is always at this gas station I go to. I decided to find him and donate the jacket our dog used to wear. It was a really nice one from Carhartt. I gave him the jacket, then went inside. When I came out he told me someone was touching my motorcycle. His description wasn't great, a man of few words and most of them were incoherent. But he did say it was a woman. The footage from CCTV was poor quality/low frame rate. The owner let me record the screen with my phone. She either parked out of frame somewhere or had walked, but it looked like it could be her. This entire experience sadly made me realize I think I am kind of face blind. It was difficult to tell what she was doing, but it didn't look like much. 2. She called my mom's small business with a fake accent to ask about me. I have no association with the business. I have no idea how she found it. My mom remarried, so even our last names are different. 3. I had roses delivered to me on a few occasions. Ironically, it was the first time I have ever received flowers. I put on welding gloves to throw them in the trash, but when I came home my grandpa had displayed them in a vase in his house. To explain stalking to my grandpa has been a struggle, after which he told me that it had nothing to do with the roses. 4. She paid a random person to approach me while I was in a grocery store. This person asked me questions, none of them stood out to me, some of them I didn't understand. My mind blanked a little because his approach was so abrupt. He came back shortly after his attempt to engage me, to apologize and tell me he was paid to ask me things. I was still very confused at this point. I thought I was going to experience an influencer in the wild or something. He offered to take me outside to point out the car. I got paranoid because he was being so pushy about it and I was still already half restrained by my own arm sling at the time. He was also refusing to tell me anything, wouldn't even say if it was a male or female, unless I went outside with him. 5. I used to work at a barber, so I cut my own hair and she claims she has my hair clippings that she took from the trash for something called her poppet. She said she does stuff to it to bring comfort to me when I'm in pain and make me feel good. 6. This was probably the worst one, because it took a mental health toll on me. Although I moved, she developed a habit of trying to convince me she was around me, having small influences over, or involvement in my day. I didn't necessarily believe her, but it impacted my ability to take down my guard. So I decided to test this. I posted a video on Reddit to this account stressing about an incident that the people in that subreddit probably thought I was a clown for asking about, but I knew she monitors my account. I also suspected she monitors my friend's Instagram account, through which she was sussing information about me and my whereabouts indirectly. I had him also post his POV of the same incident I posted to my Reddit. Anyway, I mostly did this so soothe my own paranoia. It felt reassuring to have some kind of proof that she was just making guesses to get under my skin, because eventually, I received a cryptic message about how she was responsible for it and that it was just a warm-up. No sweetheart, it was the abyss. Gazing right back. Obvious disclaimer, this is just what I learned from my experience. I don't think it's easy to get a restraining order, especially against a neighbor, so I cannot stress this enough. You need to provide very clear evidence of stalking or you won't get a restraining order. Have a formal cease and desist letter done up and serve it to your stalker. A distinction to keep in mind, getting your letter notarized is useless and serves no purpose. Having a lawyer draft it though, while it's still not a requirement or anything, it does make for a stronger letter. But honestly, if money is an issue, don't worry, do it yourself by looking up sample templates online to get the language down. What matters is you are creating proof you have told your stalker very explicitly that you want them to leave you alone in every way possible. If possible, send this letter via certified mail, as this is additional proof you can provide to show that it was delivered. Other options aside from having a lawyer do it are things like maybe filming yourself serving it. After you serve them this, do not preemptively make any contact with them ever again. Anytime they make contact, you have to keep telling them their contact is unwanted. Get proof of these interactions and your very clear response. Rehearse it, I'm serious. Do this every single time. Call the police every single time. If it's over a text, or DM or whatever, make sure you have some kind of proof of you telling them their contact is unwanted was delivered. Example, records via your phone company, a screenshot that shows it was delivered successfully, i.e., read receipts, etc. Your stalker might claim they never got the message, so just be proactive. When you call the police, tell them you want them to file a report and cite your file number. I heard if you don't tell them to file a report, a lot of the times they won't do it and claim you didn't want anything done. Try to get your stalker on trespassing charges first. A police officer told me this. From what I was hinted. Once they're in the system that way, it's easier to escalate. Put up no trespassing signs, fence your property, do anything that will help prove trespassing occurred. You really have to spell it out. Update 3. Things escalated, then got quiet. I thought it was over, but I was wrong. After the restraining order, I started feeling like I could finally breathe again. I moved out of my grandpa's place and into an apartment in the city, about an hour away. New job, new place, new start. My grandpa sold his property and moved into a retirement community, something I never thought he'd do, but he said after everything that happened, the quiet out there started to feel less peaceful and more watching. About 3 weeks ago, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I usually don't answer those, but I was expecting a call about a job interview, so I picked up. There was no one on the other end, just what sounded like rustling leaves and faint breathing. I hung up. The call came again the next day, same thing. Then again the next day. I blocked the number. 2 days later, I'm at a cafe near my apartment and the barista hands me my coffee, says this is for you and gives me a napkin with it. Written on the napkin, I miss our talks. The handwriting wasn't familiar, but my stomach dropped anyway. I asked the barista who gave her the napkin. She just looked confused and said no one gave her anything. She just grabbed a napkin from the stack like she always does. I started noticing other things. My motorcycle cover slightly askew in the morning. Mail that looked like it had been opened and resealed poorly. A woman who looked like her, maybe? On the bus I take to work, but when I turned around to look again, she was gone. Last week I came home to find something hanging from my apartment door. It was a small cloth doll, a poppet, with what looked like hair glued to its head. There was a small note pinned to it that said to help with your neck, which was especially unsettling because I had tweaked my neck at the gym 2 days before and hadn't told anyone about it. I took it to the police, showed them the restraining order information, but they said there wasn't enough to prove it was her. I installed cameras outside my apartment that night. 2 days ago, the footage caught someone approaching my door at 3:47 a.m. They were wearing a hoodie pulled low, face not visible. They stood there for almost 5 minutes, not moving, not knocking, just standing. Then they reached out and touched the doorknob, held their hand there for about 30 seconds, and left. I showed the footage to the police. They said they'd do a patrol of the area but didn't seem particularly concerned since the person didn't actually do anything threatening. I tried to explain the context, the history, but they just nodded politely. Yesterday I found a flyer under my door advertising a Halloween event at a venue about 20 minutes from my apartment. The event was called the Midnight Harvest. The flyer had a QR code that I scanned, which took me to an Instagram page. The most recent post was a photo of what looked like the back of someone's head that had my exact haircut. The caption read, "He'll be the guest of honor." I've packed a bag. I'm writing this from a motel about 2 hours away from my apartment. I haven't told anyone where I'm except my grandpa. I'm going to stay here for a few days while I figure out what to do next. The weird thing is, part of me is tempted to go to this Midnight Harvest event, just to confront her, to end this somehow. I know that's probably exactly what she wants. But living like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows. It's exhausting. I've started recording everything. Every call, every strange occurrence. I'm building a case. The police might not take it seriously now, but they will have to eventually. One last thing, I found something strange when I was packing to leave my apartment. In my closet, behind some boxes, there was a small jar with what looked like some kind of dried herbs or flowers. I have no idea how it got there or how long it's been there. I didn't touch it. I left it right where it was and took photos. It almost looked like, well, like an offering of some kind. I don't know what's next. But I know I can't keep running. Eventually, I'm going to have to face this. Update 4. I didn't go to the Midnight Harvest event. Common sense prevailed, and I stayed at that motel for a few more days before relocating to a friend's place in another city. My friend doesn't post on social media, which made me feel safer. I deleted all my accounts and got a new phone number. I was determined to disappear completely. It worked for about 3 weeks. I returned to my apartment only once during this time, with 2 friends as backup, to grab more of my stuff. Everything seemed untouched. The jar with the herbs was still there. One of my friends, who apparently knows about these things, said it looked like some kind of folk magic. He wanted to throw it away, but I told him not to touch it. I'm not superstitious, but at this point, I wasn't taking any chances. I found a new job that let me work remotely and started apartment hunting in my friend's city. Things were looking up, finally. Until I got a text from my grandpa. Someone left flowers at my door today. Roses, just like the ones you used to get. I called him immediately. He said a staff member at his retirement community had found them in the morning with a card that read, "Tell him I forgive him." No signature. 2 days later, a package arrived at my friend's address. No return address, just my name. I never gave anyone this address. Inside was a small, handmade book bound in what looked like leather. The pages were filled with writing I didn't recognize, symbols, diagrams, and what appeared to be recipes or instructions. Tucked between the pages was a Polaroid photo of me sleeping in the motel room where I'd stayed after leaving my apartment. I took it to the police in this new city. They seemed to take it more seriously than the cops back home, especially when I showed them the restraining order documentation. They said they'd increase patrols around my friend's building and suggested I consider moving again. As if I hadn't already uprooted my entire life once. That night, my friend and I were woken up by the sound of something hitting his living room window. We found a dead crow on the balcony. Could have been coincidence, just a bird that flew into the window. But my friend's apartment is on the 7th floor. The next day, I was sitting in a coffee shop working when a woman sat down at the table next to mine. I didn't look up immediately, but when I did, my blood ran cold. It wasn't her, the features were all wrong, but she was wearing the exact same costume my neighbor had worn when she came to my grandpa's door that Halloween night. The long black hair, the pale dress, all of it. She never looked at me, never spoke. She just sat there for 20 minutes, occasionally writing something in a notebook, then got up and left. I followed her. I know, stupid move, but I needed to know. She walked 3 blocks, turned into an alley, and when I turned the corner after her, she was gone. Just gone. The alley was a dead end with no doors or windows low enough to reach. When I returned to the coffee shop, my laptop was still there, but someone had drawn a small symbol on my notebook, the same symbol that appeared multiple times in that leather-bound book. Yesterday, I woke up to find my friend's bathroom mirror covered in condensation, despite neither of us having showered. Written in the fog was a simple message: Halloween is coming. I'm writing this from a bus station. I don't know where I'm going yet. My friend offered to come with me, but I refused. I can't drag anyone else into this. Whatever this is. I've done some research on stalking cases, and most of them follow predictable patterns. This doesn't. It's like she's playing a game only she understands. Or maybe she's trying to make me think I'm losing my mind. Either way, she's right about one thing: Halloween is coming. And somehow, I know that's when this all comes to a head. 23 days and counting. Update 5. I've been on the move for 2 weeks now. Never staying in one place for more than a couple of nights. Motels, hostels, even slept in my car a few times. I'm writing this from a library computer because I no longer trust my devices. 8 days until Halloween. 3 days after my last update, I got a call from my grandpa. He sounded different. Slower. He said he'd met a lovely woman who had just moved into his retirement community. He couldn't remember her name, just that she brought him homemade cookies and sat with him while he told stories about me when I was younger. I asked for a description, and he said she wore her hair up and had glasses, nothing like my neighbor. But then he mentioned offhandedly that she had asked if he'd heard from me lately, and if I was still having problems with that girl. No one at the retirement community has any record of a new resident matching his description. When the staff checked the visitor logs, there was no record of anyone visiting my grandpa that day. The security cameras in the common areas had a technical glitch during the hours he described. I called my friend to check on him. He said someone had been buzzing his apartment intercom at 3 a.m. every night since I left. When he answers, there's only static, then a whisper he can't quite make out. The building manager reviewed the security footage but couldn't identify anyone at the entrance during those times. 5 days ago, I stopped at a gas station in a town I'd never been to before. I was paying inside when the cashier said, "Oh, you don't need to pay. Your wife already took care of it." I don't have a wife. The cashier pointed to a car that was pulling out of the parking lot. I couldn't see the driver, but there was something hanging from the rearview mirror. It looked like one of those cloth dolls. I've started having the same dream every night. I'm back at my grandpa's place, standing at the edge of the woods that separate his property from the neighbors. I'm trying to see something through the trees, but it's too dark. Then I notice the trees are thinning out, dying. One by one, they fall away until there's nothing between our houses. The neighbor's house begins to change. It grows larger, more twisted, until it doesn't look like a house at all. More like a mouth. And I'm walking toward it. I wake up every time just before I step inside. 3 days ago, I checked into another motel using a fake name, paid cash. I was so exhausted I fell asleep immediately. When I woke up, there was a folder on the nightstand that hadn't been there before. Inside were printouts of every noise complaint I'd ever filed, a copy of the restraining order, and photos of me taken through windows, my apartment, my friend's place, even the first motel I stayed at. The last page was a handwritten invitation to something called the claiming ceremony on Halloween night. The address was my grandpa's old property. I called my grandpa's retirement home immediately. They said he'd checked himself out 3 days ago, said he was going home. But he doesn't have a home anymore, he sold his property. I've been calling and texting him nonstop, but no response. Yesterday, I broke down and called the police in my hometown. I explained everything, begged them to check my grandpa's old property. The officer on the phone recognized my name from the previous reports. He sounded skeptical but agreed to send someone to drive by. They called back an hour later. Said the property looked vacant, no signs of anyone living there, but they noticed Halloween decorations had been set up along the driveway. I'm going back. I know it's exactly what she wants, but I don't have a choice anymore. This isn't just about me now. I bought a gun yesterday. I've never owned one before, never even fired one, but the guy at the shop helped me pick something simple and showed me how to use it. I don't know if it'll help against whatever this is. But it makes me feel less helpless. I'm leaving in the morning. If I don't post an update after Halloween, don't come looking for me. Call the police. Tell them to check my grandpa's old property. Tell them to dig. Update 6. I'm writing this from a hospital bed. It's been 3 days since Halloween. I don't know where to start. I arrived at my grandpa's old property around 4 p.m. on Halloween. It looked different, abandoned, overgrown. The new owners clearly hadn't moved in yet. But there were decorations along the driveway, just like the police said, jack-o'-lanterns with faces that didn't look quite right, more like expressions of pain than the usual grinning carvings. As I walked up the drive, I noticed they were arranged in a pattern, forming a path that led not to the house, but into the woods. The woods that separated my grandpa's property from hers. The trees looked sick, just like in my dream. Many had lost their leaves already, and the ones that hadn't had foliage that had turned black rather than the usual fall colors. The ground was covered in some kind of fungus I'd never seen before. I had the gun in my jacket pocket. My hand kept going to it, making sure it was still there. I called out for my grandpa. No answer. I tried calling his phone again. I heard it ringing somewhere in the woods. I followed the sound. The ringing led me deeper into the trees until I reached a small clearing. In the center was a stone table that definitely wasn't there before. On it was my grandpa's phone, still ringing. Next to it was a jar, the same jar I had found in my closet, and one of those cloth dolls, this one with gray hair glued to it. That's when I heard singing coming from deeper in the woods. A woman's voice, singing something that sounded like a lullaby but in a language I didn't recognize. I followed it, my hand wrapped around the gun. I came to another clearing, larger this time. I can't properly describe what I saw there. There were candles everywhere, and symbols drawn on the trees and on the ground. In the center was a circle of those cloth dolls, all with different colored hair, arranged around a fire pit. The fire wasn't burning wood but something else, something that produced thick, gray smoke that didn't rise but instead hugged the ground like fog. And there she was. My neighbor. Dressed in a long black dress that wasn't a Halloween costume. She was kneeling beside the fire, still singing. She didn't look up when I entered the clearing, just kept singing as if she'd been expecting me. "Where's my grandpa?" I demanded. She stopped singing and looked up at me. Her face was different somehow, thinner, paler, her eyes darker than I remembered. She smiled. "He went home," she said. Her voice was different too. Deeper. "This isn't his home anymore." "Where is he?" She gestured to the dolls. "Everyone goes home eventually." I pulled out the gun. My hand was shaking. "Tell me where he is. Now." She looked at the gun and laughed. "You brought the wrong tool. But I'm glad you're here. We can begin." She stood up and started walking toward me. I told her to stop. She didn't. I aimed the gun at her feet and fired a warning shot. The sound was deafening in the clearing, but she didn't even flinch. She just kept walking toward me. I don't remember pulling the trigger again. I don't remember how many times I fired. But I remember the look of surprise on her face as she fell backward. I remember the shock I felt when I saw actual blood. Part of me had started to believe she wasn't real. I ran to her. Whatever else she was bleeding, dying. I called 911 and tried to stop the bleeding while I waited. She grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "I was trying to protect you," she whispered. "You don't understand what's coming." Those were her last words. She died there in the clearing, still holding my wrist. The police arrived 20 minutes later. They found me sitting next to her body, covered in her blood. They found my grandpa too. He was in the basement of his old house, disoriented and dehydrated but otherwise unharmed. He had no memory of how he got there or how long he'd been there. I told the police everything. About the stalking, the harassment, the restraining order, my grandpa's disappearance, everything. I showed them the clearing with the dolls and the strange symbols. But by the time they got there, the fire had gone out, and the smoke or fog or whatever it was had cleared. The dolls were just dolls. The symbols just looked like random scratches on trees. They arrested me. I spent 2 nights in jail before they released me pending investigation. The evidence supported my claim of self-defense, and there was enough documentation of the history between us that they believed my story. Most of it, anyway. But here's the thing. When they did the autopsy, they found something that makes no sense. The woman I shot wasn't in her 30s. The medical examiner estimates she was in her 70s, and her dental records don't match my neighbor's. According to her ID, which they found in the house where she'd been living, she moved into that house 15 years ago. The previous residents had no record of the woman I described. The police think I had some kind of psychotic break. That I imagined or exaggerated the stalking. That the stress and lack of sleep affected my perception. They've ordered a psychiatric evaluation. I know what I experienced was real. Every bit of it, but I'm starting to wonder if who I experienced was who I thought she was. I'm being released from the hospital tomorrow. My grandpa's waiting for me. He says we're going to figure this out together. But last night, I had the dream again. The trees dying, the house changing. Only this time, I walked inside. And what I found there wasn't my neighbor. It was me.